Welcome to Mike and Mike Theology Plus, the podcast where we talk about all things related to Christian theology. Welcome back to Mike and Mike Theology Plus,
where theology matters.
It's nice. It has a nice ring to it. Whoever came up with those were pretty sharp.
I'm pretty sure Theology Matters was a James White special.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I've heard him on The Dividing Line several times talking about human flourishing and how Al Mohler kind of coined that term, or I guess was the first that he heard speaking of it. And sometimes Al Mohler will talk about Theology Matters, and James White's like, I give him credit for using his, but he doesn't, so...
Now, when we were coming up with the name of the Facebook group that we moderate... Did one of you suggest that?
I think you did, actually.
Yeah. I mean, because that's what I remembered it as. What would be a good name? Theology Matters. So I'm not, because you came up with Mike and Mike Theology Plus.
Yeah.
And
well, I came up with Mike and Mike.
Right.
And I think you, I had a worse ending, and I think you helped me out with that.
Yeah. So yeah.
You know what's funny?
What's that?
In Theology Matters, what part of speeches matters?
Yes.
It's the first time it's occurred to me that it's not just a verb.
Right. Yeah. That's that. I thought that was part of the beauty of the word.
And theology would then be an adjective instead of a noun.
Right.
Yeah. I hadn't gotten that until now. I've been moderating it for a few months, and ding, the light just went on.
Yeah.
So
yeah. That's good.
But I've always heard it in the noun verb context, so that was just kind of burned in.
Yeah. So I'm still in my Pat's gear.
Yeah.
But we talked about maybe recording dual entrances of me either being happy or sad. But I guess that would have gone on the last podcast anyways, because this will come out. The last podcast that we did will come out the Wednesday after the Super Bowl.
True.
And this one will be the second Wednesday after the Super Bowl.
So after a long break of about 5 minutes, we're back.
We're back for our next episode. So this will be episode 3 of Unconditional Election.
Which is 14 overall?
14 overall, yeah. It's very good. So,
well, when I listened today to the one preceding the
it
one
was 12.
It was 12.
So
I can do math. Yeah.
All right, so we left off having read through
verse 13.
Yeah.
Romans 9:13.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear it. I got distracted by the siren that's going by. So
I'm more focused. I did hear it, but I didn't let it distract me.
After we do the gate on here, maybe our audience won't hear it, but maybe you will. So anyways. So what shall we say then? Okay, so verse 13, just as it is written, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. So before we move on to the next verse, a lot of people get outraged at Esau I've hated. And I heard one very smart gentleman said, what we should actually be outraged at is that Jacob I loved.
Yeah. That's the amazing, because, all right, little side note, I'm doing a writing project. I don't know if you can see, I've got a bucket of pens there. I like fountain pens and nice paper, and so I've decided to do a Bible writing project where I'm going to write from Genesis to Revelation, and I hope to finish it this decade. Actually, that's about true, because if it ends at the end of 2020, that's kind of where I'm aiming to end it in about anyway.
It won't take you a decade, but you'll finish it by this decade.
I'm hoping. I was making a 10-year joke, but I'm actually hoping to do it in about 2. But I'm just last night finished through Genesis 19. And obviously, as you're writing it out by hand, you get a lot deeper in the scripture, and you get to meditate on more stuff, or I guess less stuff, more deeply and slowly. And it has struck me over and over and over. These are not good guys, right? I mean, the first thing that Noah does that's recorded, I mean, obviously there's a time gap because he had to grow the grapes that then had to ferment into the wine. But the first thing that we get that's moral that he does after the flood is he gets drunk.
Right.
And then one of his kids does something that I still don't know what he did.
Well, I know what he did.
Oh, what?
He uncovered his nakedness.
Oh, well, thank you. That's so helpful. Well, I mean, that's a bizarre statement to
I
me
know.
because later on the priests have to wear underwear basically so that as they go up on the altar, their nakedness is not uncovered.
Right.
And like, did he just go in and peek under his robe? Or
I'm not sure
Anyway,
what's
that's-
going on, because then they walk backwards to cover him up so that they don't. Maybe, but it seems odd. I mean, we both.
But then
played,
later on, having sex with a relative is uncovering the nakedness of like
Right.
your uncle.
Yeah.
So I'd like better understanding there.
Yeah,
But
because
anyway,
we both played sports, and I think our times are changing. But at least when I was younger and playing sports, there was a communal shower, and it wasn't unheard of that you would there were other people showering while you were showering. So especially back in this time, you would think that that wouldn't be just seeing someone naked wouldn't be that huge of a deal that I think it was his grandchild, Ham's son that actually did the deed based on some wording there, but we don't have to delve into that. But it seems odd that just merely seeing your grandfather or father, if it was Ham, without clothes on would cause this huge rebuke. So
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on there other than he uncovered his nakedness.
Yeah. So anyway, so Noah, 120 years righteous guy. Then the first thing why record it if not to highlight the fact that this good guy who's blameless according to the Bible still is a rank sinner,
Right.
And then you've got Abraham who just can't tell the truth to save his life. Actually, he's trying to save his life. But the interesting thing, at least with Abraham, when he says Sarah's my sister, that's a half truth.
Right.
When Isaac does it, it's a whole lie. And it's just so interesting to look through Abraham time 1, Abraham time 2. Isaac does the same thing. Right. And so you have all of this stuff, well, are you named Jacob? Right. Which means he grasps or he cheats.
Right.
And I think Esau has some valid points when he's saying that type of stuff. And, there's the incidents with the household gods, and Abraham gets mad and berates Laban because his wife actually did steal the house.
Right.
There's just all of this. They're just rank sinners.
And thankfully, we're not. So we can understand how God loves us, but he couldn't love Jacob. Right? No?
That's not been my experience of me. No.
Right.
No.
So we could put anyone's name in there. We could put Michael McAvoy, Michael Mott, or, Joel Osteen even. And it would be...
I have loved.
And it would be...
You don't want to pick that bait?
No. It would be stunning that God would love us as sinners, and yet he does. And so if you truly understand total depravity, we're sinners. Mm-hmm. We don't seek God. We don't want God's rule over our life. We are at enmity with God. His wrath is on us, and yet some of us, like Jacob, God loves.
And to a certain extent, I would say our wrath is also on him as unbelievers. Mm-hmm. Not that does anything because we're such impotent creatures, but it's not that you've got these poor, pitiful creatures that so desperately want a relationship with God, but he's just being a meanie and keeping them under, they are spitting in God's face as much as it's worthless because they have no power to actually harm God, but it's definitely a two-way street of wrath and anger and hatred.
Right. Okay, so from there, Paul's next verse 14 is, "What shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there?" His response is, "May it never be."
Actually, I've got the ESV, you've got the NASB.
Right.
My ESV says by no means. Mm-hmm. I actually prefer...
KJV?
God forbid.
God forbid.
Yeah. Now, the truth is that is not a word-for-word translation.
But it seems to capture the gravitas of what Paul is trying to say here. Like, No, by no means, or
Right.
is that what yours says? By no means.
By no means. Yeah.
But
I think it's me genoita in the
Yeah.
Greek, and it's like the strongest negation that you can say
Right.
in Greek.
For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. So let's pause there. It doesn't depend on our activities. It doesn't depend on our mental states of wanting. It's not our will. It's not our actions. It depends on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh...
Before we move on from that, for the people who take this as corporate or national election, where do you get that? I mean, I know that Jacob I loved and Esau I hated comes from Malachi. And I know that Jacob does represent Israel, Esau does represent Edom, and that does play itself out in the history of the Old Testament. But in verse 15, God does not say to Moses, I will have mercy on the nation on whom I will, and I will have compassion on the... He's talking about people. Mm-hmm. And in that context, he's having mercy on Moses and he's having mercy on the children of Israel. And he is not having mercy on Pharaoh or the people of Egypt, except for the ones who appear to have come with Israel. Because it seems like some small number of Egyptians ran out to safety with Israel. That to me, I don't know how you get... I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, mm-hmm. and automatically expand that into some corporate or national category.
Well, that also plays in the fact that his choosing of Jacob over Esau was done before they had really done any acts or deeds. Mm-hmm. It was before birth. Now they both have a sin nature at that point in time because they're both progeny of Adam and under his federal headship, but they've done no actual sin by commission at this point, good or bad, and yet he's chosen Jacob before anything gets started. All right, so
maybe this is a good place to go back to 14 and kind of deal with the objection there, because I think 17 and 18 leads into the objection of 19.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so again, as we talked about last week, if your interpretation of Romans 9, 1 through 13 does not tend to raise the objection in your hearers of verse 14, then perhaps you're not really giving the force to verses 1 through 13 that exist there. Because Paul at least expects that the natural reading, at least of a first-time reading through 1 through 13, is people going to go, wait a second, Paul, hold the phone. So are you saying God's not just?
Right.
And then later on, we'll see another similar objection.
Yeah, because what we naturally tend to think is that good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. If you believe in a heaven-hell system, which I assume if you're listening to this podcast, you at least have...
If you don't, that's our presupposition. So that's where we're coming from.
That's the natural way of thinking. I think we talked about this a little bit 2 episodes ago. I know we talked about it 1 episode ago, where our natural inclination is to think that the people who do good get rewarded with good. The people who do bad get rewarded with bad.
I think there's that playing in here, but I think there's also what we talked about 2 episodes ago with Arminianism is kind of the natural presupposition of the human mind. And that is that I'm an integral factor in my own salvation, not just the kind of scales, are you good or bad, and that determines where you're going, which if you understand total depravity, everyone is hellbound in their natural state because they are actually evil. But also this idea that Paul is sweeping out from underneath people this idea that they can stand on their own choice. It is not the person who wills, it is not the person who runs, it is God who has mercy. And then God says, and my having mercy, my having compassion is all up to me. I will do it on those who I want to do it to. I am not obligated to mercy or compassion, because those are actually, it's a verbal form. Mm-hmm. God says, I don't have to mercy or compassion anybody. I will do that to whom I feel like doing.
Yeah, and it was at this point that RC says that he felt he could sense the injustice in it, because he said, I perfectly knew that we didn't deserve salvation, and I perfectly knew that salvation was a free gift, but to think that those who get it is merely in God's choice and it's not on we don't play a role in it seemed a bit unfair.
That reminds me of a John MacArthur meme that it's him thundering from the pulpit, and it says, if you could lose your salvation, you would.
Right.
Yeah. So do you really want to play a role in your salvation? Because, I mean, honestly, we would all fumble it if it were up to us. If it were up to come, or if it were up to us to stay, we'd be hosed. We'd be without hope.
Right. So this is the point where I think I mentioned this 2 episodes ago. He, pulled out his card and said that, at this seminary, you're required to believe and to teach what the Bible says, not what you want the Bible to say. And so this is why he had, to come to this conclusion. And I think I mentioned to you pre-recording that when I was, in my 20s or so, reading through Romans and stuff, these questions, how kind of Paul interrupts himself and asks these questions, I thought was kind of, okay, come on, let's go through. But it really does. It gets to the heart of, if you don't understand what Paul's saying, if your interpretation of what Paul is saying couldn't naturally lend itself to this objection, at least by the natural man, then you probably have the wrong interpretation of it. RC also says, as a professor, he could, give some thesis or teach something in the class, and he would naturally know what the objections were. And Paul naturally knows what the objections are to what he's saying, and it is, wow, this doesn't seem fair. Now, if you drew like 6, he has a chalkboard. RC always had a chalkboard, and he would write, maybe 1 or 2 words on there, but then never hardly use it, which I thought was funny. But he actually went over his chalkboard and he wrote 6 little lines, and he said, all right, all these people are under the fall of Adam. All of them deserve hell. And he draws a circle around 6 or 3 of them, half of them, and says, these 3 God chooses to have mercy on. He mercies, he compassions. Which one of the 6 up there doesn't get justice?
Or gets injustice, right?
Right. Which one?
At least in...
Yeah, thanks for fixing that, yeah. Which of them gets some injustice against them? No one gets injustice.
Right.
So what is there to be upset about, really, from God's point of view? If we really see ourselves as the criminals we are, we all deserve hell. God compassions some.
Right. And at the same time, I think I watched the same video that you did. He talks about kind of a governor extending clemency. Right. And if a governor pardons someone that's on death row, that does not obligate him in any way to act in any way towards anybody else that's on death row, right? He can make that choice for one person, or all, or none, or some. All of that sovereignty, and it's a limited sovereignty, but all of that sovereignty rests in his office as governor, and the people on death row have no claim on that mercy, on that grace. Right.
And if they did have a claim,
then it's not grace.
Then it's not grace, right? That's what Paul says. I think it's Galatians, but it could be Ephesians. I think it's Galatians. If you earn for it, it's no longer grace. It's a wage. 4. Oh, maybe it is. Maybe it's possible it could be in more than one spot.
Yeah.
You looking for it?
4:4, Romans 4:4. Now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due.
Yep. So, grace is unmerited favor. Unmerited.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So then we move on in verse 17. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then, he has mercy on whomever he wills, which is reasserting really what was said in verse 15. But then here comes the would you call it a contrapositive or?
Man, you're throwing that logical term out at me.
Here comes kind of the flip side of it, right? So in verse 15, he says, I will mercy and I will compassion. So kind of parallel ideas. And here are contrasting ideas, and yet it's still a parallel idea where he says, I will mercy whomever. He has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. And some people want to run away immediately and have that be judicial hardening and all of this, but Pharaoh, anyway.
Right. And I think this speaks, again, I'm pausing here because I just, thinking about how Leighton Flowers, I don't want to just keep going back to Leighton Flowers, but how he...
Well, he is one of the major voices on the other side of this issue today.
Right. But how he continues, I even had this... discussion with my daughter because we were listening to the debate as we were driving, and so I'm catching podcasts. As soon as I get out of the car, it stops, right, and I go do live, and then I get in the car and it starts. What happens to start in the middle of one of Leighton Flowers talking? And, like that stamp that you have for books, like, this is utter,
rank heresy for research purposes only.
Yeah. So we got out we were drawing our drive to a close, and I paused it and I was like, okay, girls, I don't agree with, just so you know, I don't agree with what he was saying. And in fact, lots of times he's misrepresenting what the Calvinist believes. I said, this is called a straw man. And I was like, well, what's easier to defeat, me or a straw man that's made to look like me? And so, again, when we go to bring this back to what reason I brought this up was he has mercy on who he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. The length at which he has to go through to have mercy on someone is much greater than the length he would have to go to harden someone, because our natural state is already hardened against him. All he has to do is remove some of the protections that he's put on them. Like, okay, you want to go that direction? Take it. I'll let you hate me. I'll remove these barriers, these things I had put up. You can commit these evil acts. You can have these evil thoughts. And basically you're letting that person continue down the path that they're already wanting to go. And I think that's why, Genesis says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, or Exodus says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, and God hardened his heart. They're both in there. So
they can both do something
right
that has the same goal but with different purposes.
Correct. Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yep.
So interesting little side note, I was listening to some YouTube videos of people who were trying to refute Calvinism, and I would be listening to a YouTube video and pause it and take some notes, and my son, who wasn't like really involved, but I'm at my desk, he's on the couch behind me, and all of a sudden I hear him say, "You don't agree with that guy, do you?" And I realized, I might should set some context here. And so then I explained to him what I was doing, and no, I don't agree with him. In fact, I disagree with him. And as you said, I think Leighton Flowers frequently even misrepresents what Calvinists believe. So not only do I disagree with what he positively asserts about Arminianism, which he won't call himself that, he's a provisionalist. I also don't agree with him about what he says about Calvinism. So
because he does not seem to be able to make the same distinctions that we can make between like equal ultimacy and double jeopardy. Like that's what I was kind of referring to here. With I'll have mercy on who I have mercy, and I'll harden who I desire as well. Those, just because God can affect both of those doesn't mean that his effort or what he has to go through, because in order to have mercy on us, we had to have the Son of God murdered on a cross, right? So those links were much greater that he went through.
Yeah, and in fact, to harden, he needs to reduce the effort that he's putting out and remove the common grace that he's already giving the reprobate. Right.
Yep.
All right, so verse 19, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will?" And again, if you're preaching 1 through 18 and you don't have a lot of people saying verse 19, then might I submit, a little criticism, might I submit that you're not preaching 1 through 18 correctly?
Right. Yep. I agree.
And then, to really...
Because I've had this thought too. Like, and I had to pause for what I was saying. If it were me writing this without the inspiration of the Spirit, I would answer that differently. But Paul gives, the answer that we're about to get. But, Adam chose for us. We chose in Adam. So go ahead.
Well, and I think maybe he doesn't say that here because he said that in chapter 5. Right. So he's presuming that his readers, who were probably a lot better readers, air quotes for the podcast, because most of them were actually hearers, but they seem to have just thought better in the ancient times than we do today. They seem to have been able to sustain thoughts and arguments and hear something in chapter 5, and then you get to chapter 9 15 minutes later and they're still able to put those pieces together. I'm listening through a series in Revelation, and the guy is making the point that there's so much that's introduced early on that's not resolved until the end of the book, but that people in those days, in the oral culture they were in,
could have held that in tension.
They would have known, okay, here's an unresolved thing. I'm just going to kind of hang that on a hook in the back of my brain. And this author, we don't have hooks in our minds. We do have hooks. This author is going to resolve that tension for us later. And so that by the time you get to 2021, 22, the unresolved tensions from chapter 2 get resolved, and they're able to keep that together. Yeah. But yeah, so Romans 9:20, Paul says, okay, I get what you're saying, guys. Let me break it down. No, actually, he says, but who are you, O man, to answer back to God? So who can resist God's will? Who are you to even ask that question? I mean, it's really kind of a striking slap across the hypothetical face of this hypothetical objector.
Well, it blames God for that question, puts sin at God's feet.
Right. Well, but to me, that question is kind of the quintessential objection against against Calvinism. Is, so you're saying they had never had any choice, so those who are reprobate are just going to be able to blame God for being in hell, which is not something any Calvinist I've ever heard teach on it actually says, right? No, they're in there because of their own desires and their sins that they willfully carried out in defiance of God's law.
Revelation says the book was opened and they were each judged according to their deeds.
Right. So no, we never say that. Nobody goes to hell kicking and screaming.
Right.
Or at least nobody is pushed out of heaven kicking and screaming.
Yep.
Maybe Satan, I don't know, but that's kind of different. Anyway, will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles.
Yeah, and that's a good... this was a sticking verse, if you listen to the debate, that Leighton couldn't get off of, because he wants to make this lump of clay just Israel, and some of it, it gets hardened Israel for judicial hardening, and some of it isn't.
Except that verse 24 explicitly says it's Jews and Gentiles.
Right. So, and he's, again, I don't know how, unless you come to this text with a presupposition, an assumption on how this text is going, if you're going to force your framework on this text, if you don't do that, I don't see how you can arrive at the same place that an Armenian would arrive. I don't see how you can have this just be national Israel. Sure, there's some national Israel stuff going on here, but what is in view here is salvation. No one would say it's unfair for God to judge Israel after all the things they did, all the bad things we did. We could review those, but ultimately the rejecting of the Messiah and killing him, no one would go, man, God, that's unfair. And we're like, no, that's what they deserve. So that doesn't meet those objections.
In fact, if you look back at the blessings and cursings of the law, God delayed the cursings a lot longer than he necessarily had to, according to the letter of the law.
Right.
So I would argue he was doing that to bring about the Messiah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, Israel's not getting an unfair shake
right
in this. But I agree with you. It's not primarily about the nation of Israel. Because it can't be, because Paul specifically says it's about us,
the Gentiles,
those who are called
Jews.
Us among the Jews and those from among the Gentiles. To me, if you want to read this in an Arminian sense, you have God asking the clay, or God has clay on the table, and he's looking at the clay and going, in this one lump of clay that I would presume is homogeneous, this corner of the ball over here, I like it better. I think it's going to respond to my molding better. So I'm going to make the vessel of honor out of this bit of clay. This piece of clay down here, it's a little hard. It doesn't seem as pliable. So what do you clay? You're not going to respond that way. I mean, it just, the whole point of the passage is the potter and the clay. The potter has total control. Mm-hmm. The clay has no control.
Right.
The clay is completely passive in pottery making. Mm-hmm. I mean, It is. I mean, I've done very little pottery, but I've done enough to know that
it doesn't tell you what to do.
No, it doesn't tell you what to do. And if you look back, I mean, he's quoting from. Part of it's coming out of Job, part of it's from Isaiah. I think some of it's coming out of Jeremiah, and it's the same back there, where God is making this very striking metaphor where he's, saying God is the potter. And in the Old Testament, yes, Israel is the clay there. But in this context, Paul's clearly expanding that. I don't know how you get to, there's this interaction going on, and God is choosing to make some vessel of honor because of intrinsic properties in the clay. I mean, clay's clay.
Right.
Right?
So what?
And it says specifically the same lump, one lump. It's not like good clay, bad clay. Mm-hmm. It's the same clay,
right,
with two different purposes because of God's purpose and God's will.
So let me just break this down Barney style. So what we're saying here is that God created a species that was marked with his image, a moral species, a creative species, a species with will and intelligence and emotion, and after his image, knowing that the best example of that species that would exist apart from, the incarnate Christ would fall away from him, would lead to many progeny who would fall away from him. He's going to bring some of those to him, and the rest he's going to demonstrate his goodness by sending them to hell.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at verse 22, I think the what if there is really only a hypothetical what if. I think he's very clearly saying this is what God was doing. Mm-hmm. And it says, and this is probably uncomfortable for a lot of us.
Yeah.
I mean, this is probably something we don't ponder a whole lot. I don't remember the last time I heard a sermon preaching how good this part is.
Right.
Most of the time when you hear this, it is to scare people into belief. But it says, what if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power? Yeah, God desires to show his wrath. I don't know that I can wrap my head around that fully. I don't say that as if it's like this comfortable thing and I'm like, hey, this feels good. Right. Certainly, I'm much more comfortable with pondering how God is showing his grace and mercy and love to us who are believers. But God desires to show his wrath, and he shows his wrath and he shows his justice in reprobation of fallen humanity, in punishing their sin because it's so evil. And that highlights who he is, his character, and that highlights his wrath, but then also throws into relief his goodness and his mercy. Right. Because we who deserve that wrath aren't getting that wrath.
Right. And I think if you really understand that is God's purpose, and that you really understand in the midst of God's purpose, we still are sinners who are freely choosing sin. That's by our nature. I think the difficulty here is, one, we are the guilty. I've said that before, but I think when you're the guilty one, you want to kind of minimize it. It's not that bad, but no, we're guilty. Two, I think we sometimes, again, this is repeating what we've said in the past, but we have this idea that all these people are in hell and they suddenly love God and want to come under his lordship and are wishing to be reunited with their master and to serve him. There's no indication that that's what happens. I think that they stay at odds with him. So it's not
that
like
would be a sort of a justification by death.
Right.
I mean, what about dying changes your nature?
Right. Yeah.
In fact, scripturally, all it does is seal you into the nature that you had prior to that death.
I remember, we'll probably need to close soon with this, but if you have any last thoughts, we can pick up some objections maybe next time. But I remember talking about Calvinism versus Arminianism with my mom before she was converted to Calvinism. And her complaint was that Calvinism seemed to make the people who were saved more special than the people who weren't saved. And I was like, no, Mom, it's just the opposite. We're all, like you said, out of this same lump of clay. None of us deserve it. God chose. God, it's in God who chose to draw me to him, not because I was special. We all deserved it. Hell. And I think she eventually saw that, because I would say, and we don't determine what's right or wrong based on these types of descriptions, but I would say Arminianism, it's just the opposite. Arminianism, it's the people who respond who are the elect.
Right.
And in Calvinism, it's the people who are chosen from God's will who are the elect.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of reminds me how sometimes I will take the account of the Pharisee and the publican, where the Pharisee says, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like other men, and blah, blah, blah. And I'll actually pray that prayer. Yeah. Because I'm thanking God, because I know that if not for his grace, I would be like other men.
Right.
I know my own heart, and I know that even having the Holy Spirit dwelling within me, even knowing God and wanting to pursue him, how difficult it is, and how much residing sin and abiding sin there is left in me. By God's grace, I'm mortifying that sin. By God's grace, I'm being sanctified. But, God, I do thank you that I'm not like other men, and I know that it's only by your grace and not because of some goodness that you found in me, the only goodness that's in me, and there is goodness in me, but it's all because of the righteousness of Christ and because of God's work in my life. It's specifically because I'm not special that the prayer that I thank you that I'm not like other men really has meaning and impact.
Right.
So, yeah, I agree with you that, it's... In the Arminian system, it all comes down to circumstances or innate capacities, or I'm smarter than somebody else, or wiser, or more sensitive, or whatever it is.
Saw my need. Yeah. And we're not saying that under Calvinism, the elect don't respond.
Right.
But they respond in response to God's choosing them. There is a role that we play.
Yes, God takes out our heart of stone, gives us a heart of flesh, and that heart of flesh naturally looks at God, repents, places our faith in the Messiah. I mean, there is a true choosing, there is a true response,
Right.
but there is a previous action of God that is required before we are made capable of that choice and response.
Yeah. All right.
So next time, objections?
Yeah. Objections. I mean, there are some other verses, the passages that we could go to. I don't know if we want to spend a long period of time in them like we did for Romans 9. I mean, if you take off the first 2 episodes that we did on the 94 Theses,
This is our 12th tulip episode?
This would be our 12th tulip episode, and this is the first time we've dealt with Romans 9 at length.
Yeah.
Which may mean that there are more passages in the Bible that support Calvinism than just Romans 9.
Okay, so we're pushed on time a little bit, but we're in our Theology Matters Facebook group, but there's also another one that we're a part of called Everything Bibles, which tries to stay theologically neutral.
As much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, it comes up a little bit here and there, but if people start ranting and raving for or against particular translations, that gets shut down pretty quickly. If you have a Calvinism, Arminianism debate come up, that gets shut down pretty quickly. They're really trying to keep it pretty neutral, but they were talking about how the ESV Study Bible and the Reformation Study Bible are so slanted and Calvinistic. And somebody I'm sorry. This was, I think, the ESV translation of 1 Peter 1, and how Calvinistic it is. And, well, we looked over the CSB and, golly, that read really Calvinistic too. And somebody finally responded and said, I think Peter was a Calvinist. And it did stay rather lighthearted, but I think that there's 66 books that present the sovereignty of God.
Right.
And when you understand that well, they don't all have the specificity that Romans 9 does, but the passages that people want to appeal to, I think when rightly understood, beginning with the clear didactic passages on the sovereignty of God, the fallenness of man, and what happens in salvation, those other passages become very explicable under that system, whereas I don't think the Arminian system can go through Romans 9 and make any kind of sense out of it. They have to hop around, do it out of order, make it about nations only, or the lump of clay isn't all of humanity, it's only Israel, even though Paul says, I mean, I think we uphold the sovereignty of God, God's freedom to choose for salvation, for his own glory, and the other truth that man is responsible, that our actions are free within a certain framework, and that makes us morally culpable for those actions.
Right, I agree. All right, so we're going to draw this episode to a close. If you have questions or objections or thoughts, send those to us. You can put them in the comments. I know you
can join Theology Matters on Facebook and post it up there for discussion.
Yeah, but I think it would be good to discuss in front of the larger audience. And in that vein, I still owe a discussion. So I got some. I don't know how often you go to our YouTube channel. It's really my YouTube channel, but with our videos.
Mm-hmm. Except the ones that are your videos.
What's that?
Except the videos that are just your videos.
Well, yeah, there are some of my videos there too. Yeah. Because this is a separate discussion. Let's not launch into that. But I did get some comments. The last time I was trying to nuance Piper's discussion of fallen man can do no good deed. I will get back to that. When I listened to that, I don't know how well I did at trying to explain my thought process. I think things are getting conflated between salvific good deeds and just good deeds. Mm-hmm. So we'll spend some time on that at some future podcast. And then I got a text from a friend in Arkansas, had a different take or possible take on John 6. I've read through it once. I need to read through it more, but I think that would probably be best in Irresistible Grace.
Okay.
So maybe we can deal with some of those objections too. And then if you have, eventually there's only 5 letters in Tulip.
Right.
So we're going to eventually come to the end of this. So if there's some other topic that you would, outside of the doctrines of sovereign grace that you want us to cover, I'd look forward to having
I've got some good ideas, but I would love to hear what other people want to hear discussed.
And maybe it's a short question like, how do you, I don't know, fill in the blank. How do you take this verse, or what do you think this is meaning here? And we maybe would have a Q&A podcast.
Oh, that'd be a great time if we could have just like one whole episode of like mailbag.
Right. Yeah.
That'd be cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we should come up with a sign off because we don't really have a good, strong sign off. So, but we'll think about that. For now, since I'm such a Greg Kokel copier, I'll give you Greg's sign off, which is go give him heaven. Right, because you want them to have heaven, right? You want to be a representative of heaven.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Adios. You've been listening to Mike and Mike Theology Plus, the podcast where we talk about all things related to Christian theology.